I went to trial. And it was obvious that the argument that we were making was that I was moving from one house to another, and in the state of New Jersey, there are the exemptions that allow for individuals to transport firearms and ammunition, hollow point ammunition, from the place of purchase to your house, from your house to go hunting, from your house to go to the shooting range, and in the case of firearms, from one house to another. And we spent a very long time discussing these exemptions. The prosecutor talked about the exemptions. The police officer testified that I was moving. My roommate testified that I was moving. Actually, every witness testified that I was moving. But every time that we tried to present evidence that supported that, the judge denied it. We had closing documents from the sale of my house in Colorado that sold 11 days after I was arrested, and he refused for that to be admitted. He also tried to refuse the admission of the phone call that I had with the New Jersey State Police, asking them how I transport firearms legally in the state of New Jersey. And finally, when he instructed the jury on how to deliberate, he told them they were only allowed to consider whether or not I possessed firearms, something that I never denied, and told them that if they were convinced that I did own firearms and that I had possessed them, that they must find me guilty because I was guilty of illegal possession of firearms. And we objected to that because there were the exemptions, and the jury is supposed to be charged on what these exemptions are, specifically the state exemptions, but also the Federal Firearm Owners Protection Act that allows an individual to travel from one place where firearms are legal to another place where firearms are also legal, unmolested by police officers. And the judge at first said, well, I think that the two exemptions are redundant. I don't think that the jury needs to know about both of them. So instead of giving them the Federal Firearm Owners Protection Act and the state exemptions, we'll just give them the state exemptions. And then a few minutes later, he decided that he wasn't going to give them the state exemptions either. So they were only allowed to consider if I had guns. And if I had them, I was guilty of a second-degree felony, and the punishment for that is 5 to 10 years incarceration with a mandatory minimum of 36 months behind bars. That has since been amended to 42 months in prison as a mandatory minimum, and that's what Shaneen Allen, if you've heard about Shaneen's case, that's what she was facing. Well, the jury thought this was a bit of a sham, and they came back and asked the judge for the exemptions. They pretty much said, how can we spend this entire trial talking about what these exemptions are, and then when we go to deliberate, you tell us we're not allowed to consider what they are? And the judge sent the jury back to the deliberation spot, and the prosecutor and my attorney had a conversation with the judge about what they should do. And the prosecutor told the judge, well, clearly, I think you've got a very perceptive jury, and you need to be more stern and tell them that you are the judge and you are the law, and you're telling them as a matter of law that they're not allowed to consider any exemptions. And my lawyer made the obvious case that the jury wants the exemptions. They're the trier of facts. They need to know what these exemptions are. Otherwise, you're not letting them do their job. Give them the exemptions and let them do their job. And the judge said, well, no, I think the prosecutor's right. I think I have determined as a matter of law that they're not allowed to know what the exemptions are. So I'm going to tell them that they need to disregard any exemptions that they think might exist or that do exist. And if they think that Brian possessed firearms, they must find him guilty. And they came back a second time, and that request reads, why did you make us aware at the start of trial that the law allows a person to carry a weapon if the person is moving or going to a shooting range? And during the trial, both the defense and prosecution presented testimony as to whether or not the defendant was in the process of moving. And then in your charge for us to deliberate, we are not permitted to take into consideration whether or not we believe the defendant was moving. But the judge refused again. 3 times they came back practically begging for these exemptions, and all 3 times they were denied. The 4th time, they came back and found me guilty. Later, one of the jurors would send me an email, and we would talk back and forth, and he told me he was worried about what kind of repercussions he would face, if there would be retaliation if they tried to nullify the judge's instructions. he was worried that if they did what they thought was right, and that was find me not guilty, that the judge would retaliate and somehow hold them in contempt. And that was why he told me they found me guilty. My sentencing should have been only a month later, but it took 2 months because they had to find a replacement judge. 2 weeks after my trial, Governor Christie declined to reappoint the judge to his life sentence. This has pretty much nothing to do with my case and allegedly is related to 2 other cases. One which I'll speak about very briefly because it's interesting to note what's legal in New Jersey and what's illegal in New Jersey. In one case that my judge, Judge Morley, presided over, a police officer in Morristown, New Jersey, was caught on video receiving oral sex from cows. And the prosecutor said, well, there's a problem here. We'd like to charge this police officer and get him off the police force because that's, there's something wrong here. And they found out that bestiality is not actually illegal in the state of New Jersey. So they couldn't charge him with bestiality. So the prosecutor said, okay, well, we'll charge him with animal abuse then, animal cruelty. And they moved forward with that. And during a pretrial motion, the judge wasn't convinced that you could prove that the cows didn't enjoy it. How could you prove that it was cruel? And so the charges against the police officer were dismissed. And then that same police officer went on to rack up, I think, 42 charges of sexually abusing and molesting underage girls, and was ultimately found guilty, I believe, of 18 of them. So those are the kinds of people that this particular judge went out of his way to protect, and I'm the exact kind of person he went out of his way to make sure was convicted. Ultimately, I was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The mandatory minimum was 36 months, so that means before I could even be eligible for parole, I had to serve 3 years in prison for a nonviolent and victimless crime. And I spent 4 months bouncing between state prisons before several 100,000 people signed petitions, made phone calls to their senators, and even on one day crashed the lines to Governor Christie's office asking for the governor to release me from prison. And on December 20th, 2010, Governor Christie signed my commutation order and released me from prison 6 years and 8 months early. The 4 months that I spent in prison are things that I don't really enjoy talking about, but I touch on them in the book as much as possible. Several chapters are dedicated to that time in my life. But it's difficult to talk about what the consequences are when you look at the experience of spending 4 months and preparing your entire life for the reality that it will probably be 4 or 5 years before you get out of prison. So mentally preparing yourself to get ready to go to prison, where the prison that I was sentenced to was primarily known for sexual deviants, pedophiles and rapists, and then other individuals who couldn't be in general population. So there was the occasional entertaining NBA athlete or soccer player, or even police officer or judge who couldn't be in general population. But for the most part, these were rapists and pedophiles. And in some ways, I was told that I was lucky that I was sent there and not to, say, Bayview, which has a reputation for where all of the young kids go to prove themselves and kill kids to get initiated into gangs. So in a lot of ways, they told me that I was lucky to be surrounded by pedophiles and not actually at one of these other prisons. It's also difficult because in addition to that, there's not even a conversation that I can have with my son, whose birthday is only a couple months from now, on February 15th, and who I haven't been able to see since his first birthday, which is coming up on 5 years now. And I'm afraid that all he knows is that his father is a felon, and his father is disinterested in him and doesn't love him. And that couldn't be further from the truth. But the state of New Jersey specifically does not care about law-abiding gun owners. In fact, the Attorney General in 2008 issued a directive, and I think that directive was why the police officers, the prosecutor, and the judge were so adamant about getting me incarcerated and putting me in jail. But she issued a directive to all of the prosecutors saying that anyone caught with a gun, regardless of whether they have a criminal history or if they have malicious intent, should be prosecuted uniformly and vigorously. And that simply meant that the person who was a gangbanger and had just held up a gas station and killed somebody was supposed to be tried just as severely as I was for having firearms locked and unloaded in the trunk of my car. And in fact, my mom, someone who's worked for the Burlington County Family Support Organization, knows several violent felons who have no problem seeing their son. And here I am, an individual they consider to be the poster child for Second Amendment rights, which I think is interesting because before January of 2009, I was a very recreational gun user. And in fact, since January 2nd, 2009, I haven't even held a gun. So it's interesting that they've decided to attack me and prosecute me in this way when I was really just a recreational gun owner who purchased firearms to defend his family and defend his son. And as the ultimate punishment, they've taken him away from me.